So today's luncheon program is with JBA board member and host Mike Miller. Mike, if you want to come on up. And his special guest, Mort Crim. I will leave it to Mike to do the introduction, but I posted this past week on the Facebook page for JBA a video that is with Mort Crim of the Detroiters. And if you haven't had a chance to look at that video and perhaps others of the Detroiters, you might want to do that. My class, who mostly are very, very young people, thought it was hilarious. So see our Facebook page for the link on the Detroiters. Mr. Miller, thank you for putting this panel together.
And Mort, if you would be so kind as to step on up to the mic and join us up here. Ladies and gentlemen, very proud to introduce to you an icon in the broadcasting industry, Mr. Mort Crim.
I love to know that's Latin for old.
You know, it's interesting that Richard talked about the Detroiters because obviously I looked at a few of the episodes, and one of the things that stood out to me, and some of you may have seen this episode or not, but Mr. Crim may get a little thirsty while he's up here. Would you bring us, please, a double ginger ale with a splash of cranberry?
You did see that episode.
It was in a bar, and as you can imagine, that would be Mort's drink of preference, not too much of that. Let me give you a little bit of background. Mort was, I'm not going to tell you when he was born, but I will tell you he was born in Philadelphia. He's an author of 8 books, or 7 plus 1, can I put it that way, when the memoir comes out?
You talking about the successful ones or all the books that I've written? It's a different number.
You sure? Well, it's a lot of books. He's written an awful lot of books. The memoir, which is just in transcript form now, waiting to get published, is called Anchored, which was the title of today's talk, by the way, when they asked me what should we call this, and I said, we'll call it Anchored. That's what this is going to all be about. But anyhow, he's a marketing executive. I didn't know this. He is the founder of Mort Crim Communications. He's a lecturer, as many of you know, former broadcast journalist in Detroit and elsewhere. And as we just mentioned, regularly featured playing himself on the comedy series Detroiters, which airs on the Comedy Central channel. And let me just start with that before we get into your career. But tell us about Detroiters. How did that come about, first of all, and what's it been like to play yourself? Notice I said play yourself. I didn't.
Well, could we get a new host?
You'll want to by the end of this.
I spent 20 years anchoring the news in Detroit on the Post Newsweek station, WDIV, and got a call from a talent agent in Detroit about 3 years ago, and she said they're starting this new show on the Comedy Channel called The Detroiters, and if you've seen the show Hot in Cleveland, and you know it's similar to that. It's very locally oriented, and they bring in Detroit sports figures and others to do guest shots on it. And she said they would like you to do a recurring cameo role as yourself. The premise of the show is these two guys are totally incompetent ad agent, Tim and Sam, and they run this ad agency, and they're always trying to get clients, and they're terrible at what they do. They do everything wrong.
Kind of method acting, if you know what that is.
They had one campaign for a law firm that said, I'm really a pretty good lawyer. That was the theme of their campaign. So the idea was that I would do a cameo appearance where I would show up on the TV set in this bar where they hung out. And they came up with something for me called Mort Crim's Chump of the Week, and I would name somebody the Chump of the Week. Well, the show did very well, and it got renewed for a second season, and I got a call then from the producer who said, we would like to continue the cameos. We want to expand the length of them, but we also would like to do one entire show built around you, and we'll call it Mort. Seemed appropriate. So the premise of that show was that one of their clients, a furniture company, wanted me to be their spokesman. And so we go into this big, long thing of negotiating, and I finally agree to do it. And in the scene where we are filming the commercial, I go off on a rant, start talking about ISIS and North Korea and all of these newsy things that had absolutely nothing to do with the commercial. I'm not going to tell you any more about that because you can watch it on YouTube now.
It's well worth it.
So it's been a fun run, and I thoroughly enjoyed doing it. And it's produced by Lorne Michaels, who does the Saturday Night Live. He was the creator of Saturday Night Live, and he executive produces this show. So it's very sophomoric humor, probably not the kind of thing that many of you, being close to my age, would find all that funny. But the young people love it. Our grandkids think it's hilarious. And so I guess just depending on how young in mind and soul and heart you are, whether you'd like it or
you'll enjoy it. I mean, there's no question about it. Going back to Mort's career a little bit, Mort joined DIV in Detroit in 1978, retired from anchoring TV newscasts in 1997. I hope all of this is still accurate. And also broadcast and anchored at HAS in Louisville, KYW rather in Philadelphia, and my hometown of WBBM in Chicago. One thing that I didn't know until I did some research about Mort is that Mort was apparently a very, very strong candidate for co-anchoring the ABC Evening News. Roone Arledge apparently was very much taken, and Mort was considered very strongly for the ABC World News Tonight, actually, back in 1978. What was that like?
Well, I actually went backwards. I spent 5 years as an ABC correspondent in New York before I went into local television, and passed up a couple of opportunities to return to the network for lifestyle reasons. Of all my correspondent friends, there were only two that I knew who were still married to their first wives, and that was Ted Koppel and Steve Bell, and all the rest of them had gone through many of the multiple marriages, including Peter Jennings, so I thought, this could be an exciting and fun and glamorous life, but it's very hard on family life. And our children were young, and the last offer I had from ABC was to go back and work the congressional beat, cover the Senate, and do weekend newscasts on the network. And I said, well, if I do 2 shows on the weekend and cover the Senate, what are my days off? And the executive vice president, ABC News, his last name was Burke, I can't remember his first name, but he said, well, you wouldn't really have any regular days off. And I said, I've got 2 young children, and he said, and you'd be doing a lot of traveling. Whenever a senator went on one of these junkets, you'd be expected to go with that senator. So I thought, as crazy as local TV is, it's a lot more stable, and at least I can be home with the family and have some dinner times and some morning time and some weekends. That just was not the normal routine for a network correspondent.
Right. Well, we were glad in Detroit that he didn't take that job, because it was good to have you at DIV at the time. Actually, Mort and I knew each other without knowing each other when we were both in Detroit. And it was kind of an interesting episode during my era, because I was on WXYZ in Detroit, which was owned by ABC. Of course, Mort was on WDIV, which was not an ABC station. Who owned it, by the way, at that time?
Post-Newsweek.
It was Post-Newsweek. Okay.
Same as WJXT and my good friend Tom Wills and George. And,
there you go.
And Ben Fraser, who also
world.
worked at JXT here before we hired him away in Detroit.
Yeah, you're going to meet Ben Fraser a little bit later on in the program. But when I was doing the morning show at XYZ, one of the features that I had on the morning show was Paul Harvey's comments, because Paul worked for ABC. Well, to the dismay of our general managers, both upstairs in TV and radio downstairs, Mort was the permanent substitute host for Paul Harvey whenever Paul was out on vacation or out doing whatever else it was. And all I can remember is Chuck Fritz always saying, damn it, I'm going to hear from Bonds by the end of this day, because we're featuring Mort Crim, his #1 competitor, on WXYZ in the morning. And I found it great, obviously, to have you on there. But it was a great cross-promotion, which the management of XYZ was not real pleased about.
When I was selected, and of course I'd had connections with ABC, and Paul Harvey had actually been a mentor to me when I was in college, had been very kind in giving me some advice about my career. And so we had a history, and then of course I'd worked for ABC Radio Network for 5 years, so it was not a total shock when they called me in Detroit and said, we need a permanent backup for Paul, and also we don't have anybody on the bench if Paul should drop dead tomorrow or retire. It turns out he never did retire. I was well past retirement before Paul finally died, still doing those newscasts in the morning. But the day that I was going on the air, I filled in for him about 5 or 6 weeks out of the year. And the day that I was going on the air with the first Paul Harvey newscast, they ran a full-page ad in both the Free Press and the Detroit News with a big picture of me on. And it said, of all the famous newscasters, guess who ABC picked to fill in for Paul Harvey? And I understood that you could hear Bill kicking the waste can all the way across to Windsor when that ad came out.
Yeah, we reacted to it. Those of us who weren't in management didn't care, really, to be honest with you, but Bill Bonds did, and so did the management. Let's go back to, I wanted to talk about the way you celebrated your 74th birthday. As we said, Mort has written a number of books, has a new one coming out, his memoir, but this was also a book of his that he wrote based on his 74th birthday escapade called Flight Level 74 and Still Climbing.
It was actually a video show. It wasn't a book. But I thought about writing it into a book, but it seemed more interesting and exciting.
I just got a call from your publisher. That's why I said it.
Yeah.
He wanted me to ask you to write it down.
I've been a pilot since I was 16 years old. I actually flew before I could drive a car. And was in the Air Force, not as a rated Air Force pilot because I didn't have 20/20 uncorrected vision, but I did join the Aero Club and was able to build up a lot of hours while I was in the Air Force. And when I got out, I got all the advanced ratings through the GI Bill. Took my flying very seriously. And while I was anchoring in Detroit, flew some really nice airplanes, covered a lot of news stories. There were 3 prison riots that broke out simultaneously, probably coordinated in Detroit, in Michigan, at Ionia and Jackson, and I've forgotten where the third one was, but up in Marquette. And we managed to get in my plane and fly to all 3 places and get video and interviews and be back and have them on the air that night, which would have been impossible without the airplane to cover a state like Michigan. So I've always been fascinated by airplanes, always enjoyed flying, and now in my dotage, I'm not flying the serious twin-engine airplanes anymore, but I have a little light sport 2-seater that weighs about the same as the Wright brothers' first airplane that they flew at Kitty Hawk. A little better instrumentation than that, a little better history and more reliability. But I decided I would like to do something that would be adventurous in an airplane, so I arbitrarily said, okay, I'm going to fly 7,400 miles for my 74th birthday, and I'm going to camp next to the airplane as much as I can along the way. So I flew from Jacksonville, Florida to Eugene, Oregon, taking a kind of a southern route and up the coast, and took about a month to do it. 31 airports I landed at, and actually covered more than 7,400 miles. I covered well over 8,000, but took a little handheld high-def camera with me and took video all the way and produced a television show, hour-long TV show, which ran on JXT. It ran on KYW's, about a half a dozen stations around the country that ran the show, and it's still available as a home video if anybody wants one.
How did Renee react to the idea of saying, guess what I want to do on my 74th birthday?
Why, she's here. I'd let her speak. I think her attitude was have fun.
Call when you get back to town? Were you nervous, Renee? You weren't.
Would you say that into the microphone? Don't
Yeah,
think everybody heard you.
This is being recorded too, so we want to say. Oh, really?
Yeah, we had a complete engine failure. We were visiting our grandkids in Vero Beach, and it was a beautiful, clear day like today, and just Renee and me in the airplane. It's only a two-seater, and we were at about 4,500 feet and had just passed Melbourne on our way back to Jacksonville, and the plane began to vibrate. And I started running through, it's a pretty simple checklist because it's a pretty simple airplane, and went through the checklist pretty quickly, and it was getting worse and louder, and the plane literally was shaking so hard you could hardly read the instruments, and then just all of a sudden, nothing. Wow. Dead silence. We became a glider at that point. And so I was being worked by Miami Center at that time, so they had me on radar. And I said, Miami, we've got a problem. We're going to turn back to Melbourne, which was about 5 miles behind us. And we set it up in a glide, and Renee said it was probably the most perfect landing she'd ever seen me make. Well,
certainly the glide.
I knew there would be no second chance. You're not going to go around when your engine's dead.
When you did the cross-country, you said it was a two-seater. Did you have a co-pilot with you or not?
No. No, the seat was out, and I had a tent and a bunch of camping gear, and I weighed everything because the weight and balance on that is so critical. I even weighed my flashlight and batteries because I wanted to take as much as I needed, but not be over the weight limit.
Right.
And
that's fascinating. I don't know too many people who would take that on at any age, much less at 74, to be honest with you.
well, as you get older, you think, what the heck? Going to die sometime.
Not quite the way I envision dying, by the way, with an engine going completely out. By the way, we're going to love to take questions, and I know there are a number of you in the audience who know him. We're going to have Ben Fraser come up a little bit later on to talk about the time that they spent together co-anchoring. But if anybody else has questions about any aspects of Mort's career or anything like that, feel free to do it. We talked about the Detroiter, but now we have to go to the other one. First of all, before I get into the story, how were you chosen to do the eulogy for Jessica Savitch?
Well, Jessica and I had co-anchored in Philadelphia for about 5 years, and we had become friends. And when she tragically died in that car accident in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, her mother and her sister called and asked if I would do the eulogy, and so I did.
That's great. Well, little did Mort know, but one person who watched the eulogy was Will Ferrell. And how in the world he would ever draw a connection to you and Ron Burgundy because of the eulogy that he had watched is beyond me.
I hate to correct you.
Don't.
But because I know you've never made a mistake before.
Somebody, well, at least now it's going to be chronicled.
You're very close. You're very close. You got the name Will Ferrell correct.
I think I got Ron Burgundy correct too, didn't I?
You got Ron Burgundy correct.
Jessica Savitch, I got that
and
correct.
Jessica, you got correct.
All right, that's 3 out
The
of 4.
circumstances were that Bill Ferrell's co-writer and executive producer is a guy named Mackey, M-A-K-A-Y, I believe. I've forgotten what his first name is. I met him at the premiere of Anchorman 2. But Mackey grew up in Philadelphia, and he actually had grown up watching Jessica and me on television. And Will saw me in an interview on the Entertainment Channel about after Jessica died. There was a show called Almost Golden. It was a documentary about her. And I was interviewed in that documentary. And so Will saw me being interviewed, and as he told Rolling Stone, he said, this guy still spoke in that Anchorman voice, like I have one voice for ordering ham sandwiches and another for anchoring. But he thought there was some material there between Jessica and me having anchored. Well, when he told Mackey about this, Mackey said, well, I grew up watching them on television. And so he got some old videotapes of our team, and Will watched them and decided there's a comedy there. So
How'd that make you feel?
They created a. Well, at the premiere, we were Renee and I were both invited to the world premiere in New York, and we met Will afterward at the party, and I had been interviewed all over the place. Once he announced in Rolling Stone that I had been the inspiration for the Ron Burgundy character, then I'm getting calls from Fox and Friends and Good Morning America and everybody in the country and even overseas is calling to find out what does it feel like to be the butt of this spoof, this parody. So Will thanked me. He said, I want to thank you for the good humor that you've shown in all of this. He said, I've seen several of your interviews. Piers Morgan had me on for 15 minutes, and he said, you've really taken it in good humor. And I said, well, I'll tell you what, Will. I said, I love a good parody. I said, if you'd advertise this as a documentary, I'd be totally pissed.
It was interesting because, I mean, up until that Rolling Stone magazine, nobody really knew who he had been inspired by, I guess, to do Ron Burgundy. I thought it was like Ted Knight or somebody like that because of Mary, but...
No, I was inspired by Ted Knight. Ted Knight and Tom Wills. They were my heroes.
I can see the similarity, but let me switch.
You want me to check this for any other errors?
No, that's all right. The ones in red are all the wrong ones. Let's talk today a little bit, since we've talked about yesterday. In general, what do you think of television news today and the way it's handled at the national level?
Well, I think it's never been more important, and people who say that the news is biased have some justification, but I think that statement needs some perspective. I think people think the news is biased because so much of what is on television on the cable channels is not news. It's using news as entertainment, and it is definitely biased. You can't watch Fox News and tell me that they are fair and balanced by any definition that we would have used as journalists over the years. You can't watch MSNBC and tell me that they are unbiased, that they're fair. Both of those channels, all day long, are presenting information from a definite point of view. The audience doesn't make a distinction between that because these are news people. These are people who are presented as journalists. Some are clearly analysts, and then you have people like Joe Scarborough, who's a former congressman, former talk show host. But in the minds of the public, when they tune in Fox, they tune in MSNBC, no matter what they see at what time of day, that's the media. And they're biased. And they're right. Mm-hmm. But the people who are out in the trenches covering the news, the way Tom does, the way Ben did, the way I did, those people, I think, are still making every effort they can to be fair, to keep their opinions out of the news. And so I think, the people who say the media is biased, they have a point. It's because they don't differentiate, and we have not helped them to differentiate, to understand that. And if you watch NBC's evening news, Lester Holt and CBS in the evening, ABC in the evening, you still see a lot of good journalism. Mm-hmm. You read the newspapers, there's still a lot of good journalism out there. But I think it's all the noise and the clamor of the opinionators, which now dominate the media landscape, makes it almost impossible for people to see journalists with anything except skepticism. I don't know what the answer is to that, but I think that's the problem.
Who's got the roving mic? Do you have it, Tommy? Would you give that to Tom Wills for a minute? Because I want to ask Tom a question regarding this. Tom, do you find on the local level, is it a battle to keep reporters from showing a point of view in the stories that they're delivering?
It is not, because of the company that Mort worked for and the company that I work for, the Graham family business. That's always been their attitude and outlook, despite the perception of the Washington Post. Katharine Graham never came down to Jacksonville and dictated what the news coverage would be. She never went to Detroit and dictated what the news coverage would be. We're dedicated to fairness, toward being even-handed. And that is still the way it is. And we have terrific management. You know Bob Ellis. You know he would never tolerate anything like that. And here's the thing. The media have changed so much, and I try not to blow our own horn, but because of this crowd, you know, on the night of the November election, when President Trump was elected, we launched our own gavel-to-gavel continuous election coverage up against NBC, ABC, CBS, Fox, and CNN. You know what was the most watched election coverage in Jacksonville the night of the election? Channel 4. Because we are perceived as fair and even-handed. And we honor our viewers' respect. And thank you for asking me that question. I didn't plan it, by the way, but thank you for asking it.
Well, I think, yeah, I agree with that, Tom. And I think one of the things, let's take Andrea Mitchell, for example. And I've known Andy since she was a young radio reporter in Philadelphia, and actually was instrumental in helping her make the move into television, working for us at KYW. Andy is a fantastic reporter. She has the ability, she has the guts, she has the training, she's very objective, but Andrea now does a show on MSNBC that is a highly opinionated show. And I don't think these days people are able to look at Andrea Mitchell as being the real reporter and objective person that she is, because she has been thrown into this media environment. I don't know what the answer is. I think the role of the media has never been more critical than it is today. When you have a president of the United States who says the media is the enemy of the people, and yet we are literally the fourth estate. We are the ones responsible for keeping the others accountable, the legislative, the judicial, the administrative, as well as business, as well as every institution in society that has power. We have a responsibility as journalists to keep them accountable. And it's going to be a sad day for democracy and a sad day for our nation if large numbers of people, sufficient numbers of people, begin to think of us as the enemy, not the important account holders that we are. And so I think we're under siege. Obviously, there has always been tension between the press and the president, and there should be, because we're supposed to hold the president's feet to the fire. We're supposed to ask the tough questions. And the same with Congress, the same with our court system. That's our job. And I think it's going to be a sad day if the time comes when sufficient numbers of people agree that, well, you're the enemy. We're not the enemy any more than Congress is the enemy, or the White House is the enemy, or supposedly we're all keeping checks and balances on each other so that democracy can work. So you guys who are still in the trenches and who are still at it have got a huge job.
If he doesn't mind, I'm going to ask a microphone go to Frank Denton for just a couple of moments up here, Tommy. I mean, we're talking about the electronic media, of course, so I think it's only fair that we bring print in here for just a moment. Frank, first of all, thank you for being here. I hope everybody knows who Frank is, former editor for the Times-Union.
Well, I'm happy to be here, and I'm here because I was in the Detroit Free Press for 10 years and got to watch Mort news broadcast there.
So you didn't come here because I was moderating this one?
Well, that too, Mike.
I think so. Why haven't papers become as politically polarized as what we're seeing, both in radio and TV? I mean, the type of show I did on radio, I could never do again. They wouldn't put it on because it's not radical enough on one side or the other. But how is it that newspapers were able to, certainly they've got some, editorially they've got a political slant, but just in general?
Well, there are some examples of extremist newspapers. Used to be the Manchester Union Leader in New Hampshire was way out on the far right. and I'm sure there are some on the far left as well, but generally, there's only one newspaper in a city these days, and it's been that way for 30 or 40 years. Some of the big cities have more than one, but most cities like Jacksonville has just had one newspaper, so it had on its editorial page hew to the center as much as possible.
I recall when growing up in Chicago, where we had the Chicago Daily News and the Chicago Tribune, there you could see a bit of a slant on one or the other. The Tribune was always considered to be the more conservative, and Daily News was more of the liberal. Richard, you're giving me a 5-minute notice? Wow. Okay, not fair. If that's the case, let me introduce everybody to Ben Fraser. Ben, would you mind coming up? Can you do it? Can I get a chair? Tommy, can I get a chair up here for Ben, would you mind? Thank you very much. Make it all right, Ben? Can I help you? Okay. Ben's no stranger to a lot of you who have watched, obviously, television here in our market, but I didn't know until recently and had forgotten about Ben being on the air even when I was in Detroit, but the two of you worked together.
Early,
Yes,
when Post
yes.
Newsweek first bought the station.
These are two voices I can't even compare with. Just listen to the tenor of both of them.
It was a great experience, and first of all, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure being here with you. It was back in 1979, and someone told me that they needed a co-anchor in Detroit. And I asked, or I should say I said, I don't know anything about Detroit except that they make cars there. In any event, I ended up in Detroit, and I ended up working with this legend in broadcasting. At the time, I think I had 9 years in radio and television combined. But it was always such a great pleasure to work with Mort, and I say that sincerely, because he had more professionalism and more experience in his baby finger than I had in my entire life. He never lorded himself over me, never acted this way or that way with regard to pride or ego. Mort was always like this. The only time he ever upset me was when he took me up in his plane and started pointing out the landscape below while piloting with one hand. That time, I was a little upset.
I probably had the autopilot on, so I could have used both hands to.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah, Ben was one of the early hires at DIB after Post Newsweek bought the station from the Detroit News. And those were exciting times. A lot of people being fired, a lot of people being hired. They were really trying to rebuild the news department from the ground up. And I think those were exciting times, weren't they?
They were very exciting times, and with regard to anchoring with Mort, Mort was always the king of the puns. He was a punster, and he was always shooting out these puns all the time. And I had to stay sharp sitting next to him, or something would go right past me. But I loved listening to some. You got anything else?
Well, I've always been an incorrigible punster, so you should not encourage.
See, Mort was a guy who had a very good mind. He was a great intellect. As a matter of fact, back then I think you had a photographic mind.
You're putting all that in the past tense. And that's
Mort
probably
had a photographic mind. The
probably
only
about
problem was it was never developed, right? Mort, I enjoyed your puns. I enjoyed your humor. I enjoyed your professionalism, your sincerity. And I sit here listening to you now talking about the news business and Post Newsweek. And in this town, Post Newsweek has a history of being fair.
Yes.
I'm not saying that any other station was not, but in this town, Channel 4 and Post Newsweek has a history of being fair with regard to journalism and it extended from there to, I suppose, everywhere else they were, and certainly in Detroit as well. It was a great pleasure to be able to work with a company that had those kinds of professional standards and who believed in being fair by all people, regardless of the color of their skin.
I remember one time when there was an advertiser, a major advertiser, and our ratings were in the cellar. I mean,
I remember that
the
too.
reruns of the Little Rascals were beating us. And we were, Jim Lina, who was our general manager initially, he used to say we were number 4 in a 3-station market. And that was about true. But one of these advertisers had put a lot of money into the station at the time when we were really struggling in the ratings, was very upset over something that we had said, and wanted a retraction. But what we had said was true. And I'll never forget Jim Snyder, who was our news director. He just created a wall between us and the sales department. He said, I don't even want you guys down in the newsroom. We do our job. That's to cover the news and to do it fairly. And the station did not buckle. And that was my first but not last experience with a company that was so committed to journalism and honesty and fairness that money just didn't enter into it.
That's right.
And I think in the long run, they were successful because of that attitude and because of that basic honesty.
I'm getting the hook, I'm afraid, from our president, so I'm going to have to wrap this up. But this has just been a tremendous program. I really thank you all for coming. First of all, Tom, George, thank you very much.
Thank
Karen,
you. Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
It's a tribute, really, to have the working media and others who have worked in media for so long in this community to come out to see me do this, and I really appreciate it, all of you, so thank you very much. And Ben has got, if I may, real quickly, Ben has got an organization that, and this is how actually he and I got connected. My son works for the Kids Hope Alliance, and as some of you may know, if you follow the news, they've just gotten a $300,000 grant to start giving out mini grants to fight crime in the city of Jacksonville. And one of Ben's organization, the one that he founded, was one of those who's going after one of the mini grants. So I got a phone call because he knows my son, and it's a long story, but.
It's the North Side Coalition of Jacksonville. We always say it loud and say it proud.
There you go.
North Side.
But good luck to you. I hope this appearance today doesn't upset that whole process.
No, I don't think so.
Okay, thank you all very much for coming. We really appreciate it. Thank you again, Mort. Thank you, Edie.
God bless you. And good seeing George Wendling out there. All right.
I think the saying goes, it's good to see anybody out there in this day and age. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Mr. Grimm, it's a wonderful program that, and you're right, the young people do enjoy the Detroiters. My class did laugh hilariously yesterday at your segment in the furniture store. All right, well, thank you very much again. It's a good program. We've had some very good programs this year, and many of them come from, the ideas come from you folks right there in our audience. As I said in the beginning, this is my last time. I've been very active in this group for the past 3 years, starting under Henry Reagan, as Matt Ray called him at our last board meeting, Harry Reagan. I was vice president under Harry, and then for the last 2 years as president of this organization, I've worked and enjoyed working with many wonderful board members, and that would include Matt Ray, John Harrell, who else do we have here today? Howard Kelly, Beverly Campbell, Mike Miller, of course, Tommy Riggins, Ken Thomas. Now, they've all been wonderful to work with, and I've appreciated their support in doing what I've been doing. With this election, and if you didn't get a ballot, I have them. With this election, we have three people technically, going out and leaving us as far as being board members. Beth Campbell, would you stand, please? Beverly. She's been our treasurer for at least 2 years, maybe more. Mary Jo Trinkler, who is not here, she's probably missing her first time ever at one of our meetings, but she has some issues. I was going to stream, and I was streaming just a moment ago, some of the program, telling her earlier that you should tune in. I'll stream some of this so you won't miss anything. But apparently she didn't get the technology straightened out in her mind, and she never did get on board. But both people have been very active, and we appreciate their work. I also appreciate and want to acknowledge my wife, Becky. It seems that when I become an officer, Becky, stand, please. Okay, she doesn't want to stand. But apparently when I become an officer of any organization, she is part of that as well. And so she's been actively involved in helping with a number of things behind the scenes and in front of you folks as you come in to our luncheons, and we appreciate her help. Your next president, we assume, will be the young Matt Ray. So Matt, you want to come up and say a few things?
I guess I'm the next victim. But Richard, thank you for what you've done for the organization. That really started out of Howard and Harry probably having coffee or lunch some 3 or 4 years ago, and I just hope we can continue to grow the organization, maybe a little bit younger, if that's all right with you guys, but also recognizing the history, the rich history that's here in Jacksonville Broadcasting. Just a little bit about me. I'm born and raised here, worked in radio since 1980, and I still work for Cox Media here in Jacksonville as a creative director. So hopefully we can grow into the future with other interesting topics like we had here today. For the first quarter of 2019, we're going to be focusing on religious broadcasting in Jacksonville. Out of the 70, 80 stations in Jacksonville radio, there are currently 26 religious broadcasting stations here. So I find that very interesting. They also, the aggregate of them have the most ratings in Jacksonville. So if you look at all the formats. So we're going to be looking at that. John Bosworth, who's a longtime broadcaster in Jacksonville, in Christian radio as well, is going to be facilitating that meeting. We're going to dive into how they make money, how the broadcasting and some of the heritage of that goes. So we look forward to seeing you guys back here in March, if you're willing to bring some friends. Other than that, Richard, that's all I've got today.
Thank you, Matt, and good luck. So many cables. Sorry, I almost took that one out. Last comment, which I've traditionally done at these meetings, is that make sure that you pay for your lunch before you leave. Leave your badges here for us, and have safe travels. Thank you for coming out.